It was a Thursday morning, one of those mundane starts to the day that felt like it had been copied and pasted from every other weekday. The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., and I rolled over to hit the snooze button. I always set it early, even though I never got up right away. 5 extra minutes of staring at the ceiling felt like the only peace I had before the world demanded something from me. Next to me, Jennifer stirred. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her fingers curling around it like it was an extension of herself. She didn't say good morning, she didn't even look my way. She just scrolled, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. "Morning," I muttered, rubbing my face. She replied absently, her eyes glued to whatever she was looking at. Probably Instagram or Pinterest. She'd been obsessed with it lately, scrolling endlessly even when we were supposed to be spending time together. I sat up and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feeling the slight ache in my back that reminded me I wasn't 25 anymore. "Anything interesting?" I asked, more out of habit than curiosity. "Just work stuff," she said vaguely, still not looking up. Work stuff. That was her go-to explanation these days. Jennifer worked as a freelance graphic designer, which meant her schedule was flexible and her laptop and phone were basically her office. But work stuff had started to feel like a convenient excuse, especially when she'd disappear into our bedroom for hours at a time or sit on the couch, phone in hand, laughing at something she'd never explain. Ethan barged into the room without knocking, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his shirt untucked. At 12 years old, he was the spitting image of me at his age, messy brown hair, a lanky frame, and a constant need to be in motion. "Dad, can I have waffles?" he asked, already halfway out the door again. "Ask your mom," I replied automatically, pulling on a pair of jeans. "Mom's busy," he called back. Jennifer sighed, finally putting her phone down. "I'll make pancakes," she said, sliding out of bed. She threw on her robe and headed for the kitchen without another word. By the time I made it downstairs, the smell of burnt pancakes filled the air, and Ethan was sitting at the table with a bowl of cereal instead. Jennifer was scraping blackened batter off the pan, looking more irritated than usual. "You okay?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "Fine," she snapped, though her tone said otherwise. Ethan gave me a look, his eyebrows raised as if to say, "What's her problem?" I shrugged, unsure myself. The truth was, Jennifer and I had been out of sync for months. It wasn't anything dramatic, no screaming fights or slammed doors, but the little things added up. She used to laugh at my dumb jokes. Now, I was lucky to get a chuckle. We used to sit together after Ethan went to bed and watch movies, but lately, she'd disappear into the bedroom while I sat alone in the living room. I chalked it up to stress. Marriage isn't a fairy tale, after all. Life gets busy, and people drift. But we'd always found our way back to each other before, so I figured this was just another rough patch. After breakfast, I kissed Ethan on the head, gave Jennifer a peck on the cheek, and headed to work. She barely acknowledged me, her focus already back on her phone. Work was its usual grind. Emails, meetings, spreadsheets, nothing exciting, but it paid the bills. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off at home. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overthinking things. But the doubts lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. Around lunchtime, I texted Jennifer. "How's your day?" It took her almost an hour to respond. "Busy. Working on a client project." I stared at the message, debating whether to push further, but decided against it. I didn't want to seem clingy or suspicious. When I got home that evening, Jennifer was on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. Ethan was at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Hey, bud," I said, ruffling his hair. "How was school?" "Boring," he replied, not looking up from his math homework. "Anything exciting happened today?" I asked Jennifer. She shrugged. "Same old. I finished that logo project though." "That's great," I said, sitting next to her. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. We sat there for a while, watching some cooking show she liked. I tried to make conversation, but it felt forced. She was physically there, but her mind seemed somewhere else entirely. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had been building all day. Something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Little did I know, the cracks in our foundation were about to become impossible to ignore. The weekend came and went in a blur of chores, errands, and the usual routine. Jennifer and I barely spoke more than a few words to each other, and when we did, it felt like we were both reading from a script. Sunday afternoon, Ethan had a soccer game. He was buzzing with excitement, talking nonstop about how he was going to score a goal this time. I looked forward to his games. If nothing else, they were an escape from the growing tension at home. Jennifer, on the other hand, didn't seem as enthusiastic. "You coming to the game?" I asked as she stood at the kitchen counter, texting someone. She glanced up, her expression blank. "I can't. I have a deadline for that big project. I told you about it last week." "You sure?" I pressed. "Ethan would love to see you there." "I'll make it to the next one," she said dismissively, turning her attention back to her phone. Ethan was disappointed, of course, but he shrugged it off in that resilient way kids have. "It's fine," he said as we got into the car. "Mom's always busy." That hit me harder than it should have. I didn't say anything, but the truth of his words stung. At the game, I stood on the sidelines, cheering louder than I usually did. Ethan played hard, scoring a goal just like he'd promised. He looked over to where we stood, his face lighting up when he saw me clapping and yelling. For a moment, all the worries about Jennifer faded away, replaced by the pride I felt watching my boy shine. But the feeling didn't last. When we got home, Jennifer was in the living room, her laptop on the coffee table and her phone beside her. She looked up briefly as we walked in. "How'd it go?" "Scored a goal," Ethan said, dropping his gear by the door. "That's great," she said with a smile that didn't match her tone. Ethan ran upstairs, leaving Jennifer and me alone. I stood there for a moment, watching her type away on her laptop. She seemed so detached. It was like she was a stranger in her own home. "Hey," I said, sitting down beside her. "Is everything okay? You've seemed a little off lately." She sighed, closing her laptop and leaning back against the couch. "I'm fine, Mike. Just busy. Work's been stressful, and I'm trying to keep up." "I get that," I said carefully. "But it feels like you've been distant." "Distant?" she repeated, frowning. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe it's just me. I feel like we're not connecting the way we used to." She rolled her eyes, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Mike, not everything is a big deal. People get busy. It doesn't mean something's wrong." Her defensiveness caught me off guard. I wasn't trying to accuse her of anything, I just wanted to understand why things felt so off. But her reaction only added fuel to the fire of doubt simmering in my mind. I let it go for the moment, not wanting to push her further. But as I sat there next to her, the distance between us felt larger than ever. Over the next few weeks, things didn't improve. Jennifer was out more often, always with a vague excuse about errands or work meetings. At first, I believed her. But the more it happened, the harder it was to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. Then there was the phone. She never left it unattended, always keeping it within arm's reach. If I walked into the room while she was texting, she'd lock the screen instantly. Once I caught a glimpse of her messages and saw a name I didn't recognize, Brad. "Who's Brad?" I asked casually. "Just a client," she said quickly, slipping her phone into her pocket. I wanted to press further, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of what I might find if I pushed too hard. One Friday evening, Ethan was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and Jennifer said she had to run to the store for groceries. I offered to come with her, but she waved me off. "It's just a quick trip," she said, grabbing her purse. After she left, I sat on the couch, flipping aimlessly through channels. But my mind wasn't on the TV. I couldn't stop thinking about the phone, about the way she always had an excuse, about how she hadn't seemed like herself in months. An hour passed. Then 2. Groceries didn't take that long. I texted her, "Everything okay?" No response. By the time she got home, it was almost 10 p.m. She came through the door with a single grocery bag and a strained smile. "Sorry I took so long," she said, setting the bag on the counter. "The store was packed." "For 3 items?" I asked, gesturing to the bag. She hesitated, then shrugged. "I ran into an old friend and got caught up talking. You know how it is." I nodded, but inside, alarm bells were ringing. The following week, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I started paying closer attention, watching her habits, noting the times she left and how long she was gone. I wasn't proud of it, but the doubt was eating me alive. What I found only made things worse. Her so-called work meetings didn't line up with her actual schedule. The times she claimed to be at the store or running errands didn't add up. And then there were the phone calls. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her muffled voice from the other room. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. Something was going on, and I was determined to find out what. Life carried on, or at least it appeared that way on the surface. Ethan kept busy with soccer practice and his growing obsession with video games. Jennifer continued to drift further into her own world, a mix of work excuses, late-night phone calls, and occasional bursts of affection that felt more like apologies than genuine connection. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me for weeks refused to go away. Every now and then, I'd catch Jennifer staring at her phone with an intensity that didn't seem work-related. If I walked into the room, she'd lock the screen or slip the phone into her pocket, plastering on a quick smile. "Who's so important you're glued to your phone all the time?" I joked one night as we sat on the couch after Ethan had gone to bed. "Just a client," she said, not missing a beat. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But her answer, so smooth and rehearsed, only added to the growing knot in my stomach. A few days later, Ethan came home from school looking unusually quiet. Normally, he'd burst through the door with a dozen stories about his day, complaining about teachers or bragging about how he dominated in gym class. But that afternoon, he simply dropped his backpack by the door and muttered, "Hi, Dad," before heading upstairs. I gave him some space, figuring he'd had a tough day, but when I checked on him later, he was curled up on his bed with his headphones in, staring blankly at his tablet. "Hey, buddy," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Everything okay?" He shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. Just a bad day?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the side. "Yeah. Mr. Jacobs gave us this huge project, and I don't even know where to start." I ruffled his hair. "You'll figure it out. You're a smart kid. If you need help, I'm here, okay?" He nodded but didn't look at me. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right, but I didn't press him. I told myself it was just middle school drama, nothing to worry about. Jennifer's behavior, however, was harder to ignore. She'd started taking more frequent trips. To the store. Or to meet with a client. Always insisting it was work-related. Once or twice, Ethan asked why Mom was gone so often, and I'd shrug and say something noncommittal. But the truth was, I didn't know. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Jennifer left for a quick meeting, and didn't come back for over 2 hours. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off. "It was just a long conversation," she said, pulling off her coat. "Some clients like to talk about their vision in detail." "At 9 o'clock at night?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Her eyes flashed with irritation. "Mike, you know how freelance work is. Not everyone has a 9-to-5 schedule." I nodded, biting back the words I wanted to say. The following weekend, Ethan and I went to one of his soccer games. Jennifer had promised she'd be there, but when we got to the field, she was nowhere to be found. "Where's Mom?" Ethan asked, his brow furrowed. "She said she'd meet us here," I replied, checking my phone for a text. Nothing. The game started, and Ethan kept glancing toward the sidelines, looking for her. When he scored a goal in the second half, he turned instinctively toward the spot where she should have been, but his face fell when he realized she wasn't there. After the game, he was unusually quiet as we walked to the car. "You played great, bud," I said, trying to cheer him up. "Thanks," he muttered, staring at his shoes. I didn't push him. I could tell he was upset, and I didn't blame him. Jennifer finally came home later that evening, carrying a grocery bag like it was some kind of peace offering. She smiled at Ethan and said, "How was the game?" He shrugged, barely looking at her. "You missed it," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I know," she said quickly. "I got caught up at the store. I'm sorry." Ethan didn't say a word. He just grabbed his plate from the table and went upstairs, leaving Jennifer and me alone in the kitchen. "Mike, I'm sorry," she said, turning to me. "I didn't mean to miss it. Things just got hectic. Lately, it seems like things are always hectic with you," I said. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Look, I'm trying, okay? I'm doing my best to juggle everything." "I'm not asking you to juggle," I said. "I'm asking you to be present. For me. For Ethan. You've been so distant lately, and I don't understand why." She didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "I know. And I'll do better. I promise." But her words rang hollow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on than she was willing to admit. Ethan didn't bring up his mother's absence at the game, but his mood stayed subdued for days. He wasn't his usual energetic self, and even his enthusiasm for soccer seemed to wane. One evening, I overheard him talking to Logan on the phone. "Yeah, she said it was a work thing," he said, his voice low. "But I don't know, it's weird." I didn't hear Logan's response, but Ethan sighed and said, "Maybe. I don't want to think about it." The knot in my stomach tightened. What wasn't he telling me? The tension in our house continued to build, quiet but heavy, like the air before a storm. Jennifer carried on with her vague excuses, Ethan withdrew further into himself, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for something to push me over. I didn't know when the truth would come out, but I could feel it coming. The following week felt heavier than usual, like a slow-moving storm creeping closer to the house. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when I started checking the clock more often, or why I noticed every time Jennifer's car wasn't in the driveway when it should have been. It wasn't that I wanted to become suspicious. I hated the thought of being the guy who second-guessed his wife's every move. But the unease wouldn't go away. Ethan, too, seemed more reserved. He wasn't bringing home the usual energy I'd come to expect, and when I tried to talk to him, he gave me one-word answers or shrugged his way out of the conversation. That Friday, I left work early, hoping to surprise Ethan with pizza night. He'd been moody all week, and I figured a movie marathon and some greasy food might help lighten the mood. I even stopped at his favorite pizza place, the one that made deep dish the way he liked it, with extra cheese that stretched for miles. When I got home, though, the house was quiet. Too quiet. "Ethan?" I called out, setting the pizza box on the counter. No answer. I wandered upstairs and peeked into his room. His backpack was on the floor, and his sneakers were kicked haphazardly under the desk, but he wasn't there. His tablet sat on his bed, the screen still lit up with a paused game. I frowned, checking my phone for any missed messages. Nothing. Just as I was about to text him, I heard the faint sound of movement downstairs, feet scuffing against the tile. "Ethan?" I called again, heading back down. This time, I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. His face was pale, his jaw tight. He didn't look at me when I walked in. "Hey, bud," I said carefully. "Everything okay?" He shrugged. "You're not mad about the pizza, are you?" I thought it'd be a nice surprise. Still, he didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his shoulders tense. "Ethan, talk to me," I said, my voice firmer. He finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed like he'd been holding back tears. "Dad." His voice cracked, and he took a shaky breath. "Do you ever feel like like Mom's hiding stuff from us? My heart stopped. What do you mean? I don't know, he said quickly, as if regretting the question. Forget it. No, hold on, I said, stepping closer. You can tell me. What's going on? He hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously. It's just, she's gone a lot, you know? And sometimes, when I'm home, I hear her talking to someone on the phone. A guy. A guy? I asked, my chest tightening. He nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard her say his name once. Brad. Brad. The name hit me like a slap to the face. Ethan looked at me, his expression torn between worry and guilt. I didn't want to tell you because, what if I'm wrong? I don't want to cause trouble. My stomach churned. I crouched down to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ethan, listen to me. You're not in trouble, okay? And you can always tell me if something's bothering you. I'm glad you told me this. He nodded, though he didn't look reassured. Are you mad at her? I don't know yet, I admitted. But don't worry about that. I'll handle it. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I stayed up late, replaying our conversation in my mind. The name Brad stuck out like a neon sign, flashing and unignorable. Jennifer had mentioned a Brad once before, some client she'd been working with on a long-term project. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I decided to pay closer attention. If Ethan was noticing these things, then it wasn't just in my head. Over the weekend, Jennifer left the house twice, claiming she needed to meet with clients. Both times, she was gone for hours, and both times, her explanations felt vague and hurried. I started keeping track of her comings and goings, noting the times she left and when she returned. It wasn't long before patterns started to emerge. On Tuesday, I had a rare work-from-home day. Jennifer seemed surprised when I told her, her smile tight and uneasy. That's nice, she said, grabbing her coffee. I might have to step out later, though. Brad wants to review some edits. There it was again. Brad. Why don't you invite him here? I suggested, keeping my tone light. I'd love to meet this guy you're always talking about. Her grip on the coffee cup tightened, but her smile didn't waver. Oh, he's really busy. It's easier for me to go to him. Where's his office? She hesitated for half a beat. Downtown. I nodded, letting it drop, but my mind was racing. That afternoon, while Jennifer was at a meeting, I decided to do a little digging. I knew she kept a separate email account for work, one she rarely logged into on the home computer. But today, I noticed the browser tab was still open, the login screen waiting. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the keyboard. Part of me felt guilty for snooping, but the other part, the part fueled by suspicion and frustration, pushed me forward. I guessed her password on the third try. The inbox loaded, and my stomach flipped. There were dozens of emails from Brad, most of them work-related at first glance. But as I scrolled further back, the tone of the messages shifted. Had a great time at lunch yesterday. Looking forward to our next meeting. Can't stop thinking about that red dress you wore last week. Stunning. My hands trembled as I read through the exchanges. The messages weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. The subtext was clear enough. This wasn't just a professional relationship. I sat back in the chair, my chest heaving. Jennifer had been lying to me for months, and now I had proof. But the real question was, what was I going to do about it? Ethan hadn't been himself for days. His usual energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost sullen demeanor. He stayed in his room more than usual, barely spoke at the dinner table, and avoided Jennifer altogether. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd shrug and mutter, "I'm fine," before quickly changing the subject. At first, I chalked it up to school stress. Middle school can be brutal, and Ethan was dealing with plenty of changes, new teachers, new friends, and the pressure to fit in. But as the days dragged on, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of growing pains. What I didn't know was that Ethan was carrying a secret too heavy for a 12-year-old to bear. It happened a week ago, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Ethan had come home early because of an unexpected half-day at school. He'd thought about texting me, but he figured he'd surprise me with a cleaned-up living room and maybe even start on his homework before I got home. When he opened the door, the first thing he noticed was the car in the driveway, a silver sedan he didn't recognize. Mom must have company, he thought, dropping his backpack by the door. He kicked off his shoes and headed for the kitchen to grab a snack. That's when he heard the muffled laughter coming from upstairs. It was Mom's voice, and a man's. Curiosity got the better of him. Ethan crept up the stairs, careful to avoid the spots that creaked. As he got closer to the bedroom, the voices became clearer, though he couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. The door was slightly ajar, and Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. He pushed the door open just enough to see inside, and his breath caught in his throat. There was his mother, sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand resting on a man's knee. The man, tall, dark-haired, and wearing a suit, was leaning in close, laughing at something she'd said. It wasn't an innocent laugh. Ethan felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. He didn't understand all the complexities of adult relationships, but he knew what he was seeing wasn't right. "Mom?" His voice cracked as he pushed the door open wider. Jennifer jumped, her hand flying away from the man like she'd been burned. The man stood up abruptly, smoothing his tie as if nothing had happened. "Ethan!" Jennifer exclaimed, her voice higher than usual. "What are you doing home?" I got out early," he stammered, his eyes darting between her and the man. "Who's this?" Jennifer's expression shifted into something Ethan had never seen before, panic. "This is Brad," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He's a work friend. We were just talking about a project." Brad, for his part, avoided looking at Ethan altogether. He muttered something about needing to leave and slipped past Ethan, disappearing down the stairs and out the door without another word. Jennifer knelt in front of Ethan, her hands gripping his shoulders tightly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "You didn't see anything, okay? Brad is just a friend, and you have no reason to think otherwise." "But—" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I mean it, Ethan. You don't tell your dad about this. Do you hear me?" Her grip on his shoulders tightened, and Ethan nodded, more out of fear than agreement. "Good," she said, her tone softening slightly. "You know how much your dad has on his plate right now. The last thing he needs is to deal with something like this. It would hurt him, Ethan. Do you want to hurt your father?" Ethan shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "Then let's keep this between us," she said, pulling him into a hug. "It's better for everyone this way." For the next week, Ethan carried the weight of what he'd seen like a lead ball in his chest. He avoided his mother as much as he could, refusing her offers to drive him to practice or help him with his homework. At the same time, he couldn't bring himself to tell me what had happened. Every time he tried to work up the courage, Jennifer's words rang in his ears. "Do you want to hurt your father?" The guilt ate away at him. He loved me and didn't want to keep secrets, but he also didn't want to be the one to shatter our family. He was stuck in an impossible position, and the stress of it showed. Jennifer, meanwhile, went about her days as if nothing had happened. She still smiled at me over dinner, still kissed me goodnight, but there was a nervous edge to her that hadn't been there before. Every time Ethan looked at her, his stomach churned. I noticed the tension between them but didn't press it. I figured it was just a mother-son thing. Maybe she nagged him about his grades or told him to clean his room one too many times. I had no idea the truth was far darker than I could have imagined. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they're buried. The week dragged on, with Ethan growing quieter and Jennifer acting increasingly jittery. She'd been careful, too careful, almost as if trying to pretend everything was fine while keeping one eye on Ethan. Whenever I was in the room, she'd turn on the charm, making small talk and asking about my day. But when she thought I wasn't paying attention, her face would fall into an expression of unease. Ethan, on the other hand, avoided Jennifer entirely. He'd leave the room whenever she walked in and found excuses to spend time at a friend's house or in his room. I tried to ask him about it, but he just shrugged and muttered, "I'm fine, Dad. It's nothing." It didn't feel like nothing. One night I found him sitting on the couch with his tablet, scrolling mindlessly through YouTube videos. He looked up as I walked in, his expression guarded. "Hey, bud," I said, sitting down next to him. "You've been kind of quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Yeah," he said quickly, his eyes darting back to the screen. "Is it school? Soccer? Something else?" He hesitated, his fingers tightening around the tablet. "It's nothing, Dad." "Really?" The way he avoided my gaze told me it wasn't nothing, but I didn't push him. I figured he'd open up when he was ready. Jennifer's behavior only added to the unease. One evening, I came home to find her on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low and hurried. She turned her back when she saw me walk in, as if shielding the conversation. "Okay, I'll call you later," she said, hanging up quickly. "Who was that?" I asked, setting my bag on the counter. "Just a client," she said, flashing me a quick smile. "Another late-night project?" "Something like that," she replied, her tone dismissive. I didn't say anything, but the pit in my stomach grew deeper. The turning point came later that week, in the most unexpected way. I'd left my phone on the dining table while I was upstairs helping Ethan with a history project. When I came back down, I saw Jennifer standing near the table, her hand hovering over my phone. "Forget something?" I asked, startling her. She jumped and laughed nervously. "No, just looking for my charger. I thought it was over here." Her explanation didn't make sense, considering her charger was always plugged in by the couch. She brushed past me quickly, muttering something about needing to finish an email. I picked up my phone and saw that it was still unlocked, the screen displaying a notification for an app one rarely used, our shared cloud storage. Curious, I opened it. I hadn't used the app in months, and I wasn't even sure what was in there. But as I scrolled through the files, one stood out, a video labeled with nothing but a date. I tapped on it, my heart pounding as the video loaded. What I saw made my blood run cold. The footage was shaky, clearly taken from a low angle. It showed Jennifer in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with a man I didn't recognize. The man, tall, dark-haired, and wearing a crisp white shirt, leaned toward her, his hand brushing against her thigh. The audio was faint but clear enough to pick up snippets of their conversation. "You're sure he's at work?" the man asked. Jennifer laughed softly, her tone flirtatious. "Mike's always at work. We've got plenty of time." The video ended abruptly, leaving me frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Who had recorded this? How had it ended up in our cloud storage? Then it hit me. Ethan's tablet was synced to the same account. My son had been the one to record this. I sat down, my hands trembling as I tried to piece everything together. Ethan must have walked in on Jennifer and this man, Brad I assumed, and recorded it, either out of shock or as proof. But why hadn't he told me? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Jennifer must have known about the recording. She'd probably pressured him to stay silent, maybe even manipulated him into thinking it was for the best. Anger surged through me, not just at Jennifer but at myself. How had I been so blind? How long had this been going on right under my nose? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Confronting Jennifer without a plan wouldn't get me anywhere. I needed to think carefully about my next move. But one thing was certain, I couldn't let her get away with this. After the video, there was no going back. I sat in the dining room for what felt like hours, staring at my phone screen, watching the seconds of the video tick by, over and over again. My mind reeled with questions. How had it come to this? How long had Jennifer been lying to me? And what had she said to Ethan to keep him quiet? Ethan, my heart broke for him. No kid should have to carry a secret like this. He'd been avoiding Jennifer all week, and now I understood why. The guilt must have been eating him alive. But now, I had the proof. Jennifer had been caught, even if she didn't know it yet. I could confront her right then and there, demand answers, force her to explain herself. But I didn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, I kept the knowledge to myself, pretending everything was normal. It wasn't easy. Every time Jennifer smiled at me or kissed me goodnight, I felt my stomach churn. But I needed time to plan, to figure out how to protect Ethan and confront her in a way that wouldn't blow everything up too quickly. Jennifer, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of what I'd discovered. She went about her usual routine, taking calls in hushed tones, disappearing for hours at a time under the guise of client meetings. If she noticed the tension in the house, she didn't let on. Ethan, on the other hand, was visibly struggling. He barely spoke at dinner, his responses clipped and distant. He spent most of his time in his room, avoiding both of us. One evening, I found him sitting on the floor of his room, organizing a stack of old soccer trophies. "Hey, bud," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Mind if I come in?" He shrugged. I sat down next to him, picking up a small trophy with a gold-painted soccer ball on top. "You remember this one? Your first tournament. You scored that goal from midfield." "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long," I said, setting the trophy down. "You've been really quiet lately. I know something's on your mind." "I'm fine," he said quickly, avoiding my gaze. "Ethan," I said gently, "you don't have to hold everything in. You can talk to me. About anything." His eyes flicked up to mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tell me. But then he shook his head. "It's nothing, Dad. I'm okay." I didn't push him. I didn't want to force him into a conversation he wasn't ready to have. But as I left his room that night, I made a promise to myself, no matter what, I would get to the bottom of this. The breaking point came a few nights later. Jennifer and I were sitting on the couch after dinner, the TV playing in the background. She was scrolling through her phone, her face lit up by the screen's glow. I couldn't take it anymore. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She glanced up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You're always on your phone," I said. "Who are you talking to all the time?" She hesitated for half a second, then shrugged. "Clients. You know how it is." "Do I?" I said, my eyes locking on hers. Her expression shifted, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Mike, what's this about?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "This is about you lying to me. About you spending all your time with someone else instead of your family. About Ethan avoiding you like the plague because he knows something I don't." Jennifer froze, her face going pale. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaky. "Don't you?" I said, my voice rising. "Because I think you do. I think you've been hiding something for a long time, and I'm done pretending everything is fine." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the TV. Jennifer stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to come up with something to say. Then she stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. "I don't have to listen to this," she said, grabbing her phone and heading for the stairs. I let her go. I didn't need her to admit anything. I already knew the truth. The next morning, I woke up to find Jennifer gone. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and she hadn't left a note or sent a text. Part of me wasn't surprised. She'd always been the type to run when things got difficult. Ethan came downstairs a while later, looking more tired than usual. "Morning," I said, pouring him a bowl of cereal. "Morning," he mumbled, sitting down at the table. We ate in silence for a few minutes before I said, "Ethan, is there anything you want to tell me? Anything at all?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "No," he said quietly. I nodded, though my heart ached. I wanted to tell him I knew that he didn't have to carry the burden of what he'd seen anymore. But I also wanted him to feel safe enough to tell me on his own terms. For now I'd wait. But not for long. The tension in the house was suffocating. Jennifer continued her disappearing acts, and when she was home, her demeanor was that of someone walking on eggshells. She avoided eye contact with me, answered questions in clipped sentences, and seemed to spend more time locked in the bedroom than anywhere else. Ethan, meanwhile, had retreated even further into himself. His once vibrant personality had been replaced by a quiet, almost sullen energy. He barely touched his dinner, hardly spoke to me, and refused to engage with Jennifer at all. I tried to be patient, to give him the space he needed, but my own frustration was building. Every time I looked at him, I saw the weight of the secret he was carrying, and it made my blood boil. Jennifer had put him in an impossible position, and I couldn't forgive her for that. One evening, Ethan came home from soccer practice looking worse than usual. His face was pale, and his eyes were red, like he'd been crying. "Hey, bud," I said as he dropped his bag by the door. "Rough practice?" He shrugged. "It's fine. Dinner's almost ready. Why don't you wash up?" He nodded but didn't move. Instead, he stood there, staring at the floor. "Ethan?" I said gently. "What's wrong?" He took a shaky breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Dad, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart skipped a beat. "Okay," I said carefully, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Let's sit down." He hesitated, glancing toward the stairs where Jennifer was likely holed up in the bedroom. "I don't know if I should." "You can tell me anything," I said, my voice steady. "You know that, right?" Ethan sat down across from me, his shoulders slumping like he was carrying the weight of the world. "It's about Mom," he said, his voice trembling. I leaned forward, my stomach twisting into knots. "What about her?" He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. "I saw her. With someone else. A man. In your room." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. My first instinct was to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the anger boiling inside me made it hard to find the right words. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice tight. "Last week," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I came home early from school, and there was this car in the driveway. I went upstairs and I saw them." I clenched my fists under the table, my jaw tightening. "Did she say anything to you?" He nodded. "She told me not to tell you. She said it would hurt you, and she made me promise to keep it a secret." My chest burned with rage. "Ethan, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You did nothing wrong. Okay? This isn't your fault. But I didn't tell you," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have told you sooner." I reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "I'm so proud of you for telling me now," I said. "You've been carrying this all by yourself, and that's not fair. But you don't have to carry it anymore. I'm going to take care of this." He nodded, his lower lip trembling. "I'm sorry, Dad." "Don't be," I said firmly. "You did the right thing." That night, after Ethan went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of his confession pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head, imagining the pain and confusion he must have felt walking in on Jennifer and him. Brad. I wanted to storm upstairs, to confront Jennifer right then and there, but I knew I had to tread carefully. I needed a plan, a way to confront her that wouldn't turn into a screaming match. And most importantly, I needed to protect Ethan. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I didn't tell Jennifer why. I simply said I wasn't feeling well and stayed in the living room with my laptop. Around 10 a.m., Jennifer came downstairs, fully dressed and carrying her purse. "I've got a meeting," she said, her tone casual. "Another one?" I said, raising an eyebrow. She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes. Is that a problem?" "No," I said, forcing a smile. "Just wondering how long you'll be gone." "Not long," she said, heading for the door. "I'll be back in a couple of hours." I waited until her car pulled out of the driveway before grabbing my keys and heading out the door. I didn't know exactly where she was going, but I had a pretty good idea. Following her wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. Jennifer wasn't exactly subtle. She headed straight for a small cafe downtown and parked in the lot out front. I stayed a few cars back, watching as she got out of the car and walked inside. A few minutes later, Brad arrived. Seeing him in person, walking into the cafe like he didn't have a care in the world, made my blood boil. He was tall, with slicked back hair and a smug smile that made me want to punch him. I stayed in my car, watching through the window as they sat at a table near the back. Jennifer leaned in close, laughing at something he said, her hand brushing against his arm. It took everything in me not to march in there and confront them. But I needed to stay calm, to gather my thoughts and figure out my next move. As I sat there, staring at the two of them, I realized one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't just a mistake. This was a betrayal that had been planned, hidden, and carried out right under my nose. And I wasn't going to let it slide. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, watching Jennifer and Brad through the cafe window. They were laughing, leaning in close, acting like they didn't have a care in the world. Like I didn't exist. Like Ethan didn't exist. The rage simmering inside me threatened to boil over, but I forced myself to stay calm. Storming in there would only cause a scene, and I needed to handle this in a way that would leave no room for Jennifer to manipulate the situation. When they finally stood to leave, I ducked lower in my seat, watching as they exited the cafe. Brad walked her to her car, his hand resting on the small of her back like he owned her. She turned to him, said something I couldn't hear, and then they embraced, a quick but intimate hug that made my stomach churn. As they parted ways, I snapped a picture of them from my phone, the betrayal captured in a single frame. Proof if I needed it. I didn't go home right away. I drove around aimlessly for an hour, trying to process what I'd seen and figure out my next move. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew I had to approach this carefully. By the time I walked through the front door, Jennifer was already home, sitting on the couch with her laptop open. She looked up as I entered, her expression unreadable. "Feeling better?" she asked, her tone casual. "Yeah," I said, hanging my keys on the hook. "Just needed a little fresh air." She nodded, turning her attention back to her screen. She was so good at pretending, at acting like everything was normal, and for a moment, it made me question what I'd seen. But then I remembered Ethan's confession, the video, the moment at the cafe. I wasn't wrong. That night, after Ethan went to bed, I decided it was time to confront her. I sat at the dining table, waiting for her to come downstairs. When she finally did, she looked surprised to see me sitting there, my phone on the table in front of me. "What's up?" she asked, pouring herself a glass of wine. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calm but firm. She froze for a moment, the glass halfway to her lips. "About what?" I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down." Her hesitation was brief, but telling. She set the glass down and sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Mike, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, my fingers drumming against the table. "I know about Brad." Her face went pale, her carefully constructed facade cracking in an instant. "What are you talking about?" "Don't," I said, my voice sharp. "Don't insult me by lying." "I know, Jennifer. I've known for a while now." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You've been seeing him behind my back," I continued, my voice trembling with anger. "You've been lying to me, to Ethan, and for what? For him? Mike, it's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, slamming my hand on the table. "I've seen the messages. I've seen the video. I watched you with him today at the cafe." Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. You followed me?" "I didn't need to follow you," I said coldly. "You've been sloppy, Jennifer." "And Ethan? He saw you. Did you know that? He walked in on you with Brad. And you made him keep it a secret. Do you have any idea what that did to him?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. Mike, I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. Sorry? I said, laughing bitterly. You're sorry because you got caught. Not because of what you did. She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, Mike, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, I said, standing up. You betrayed me. You betrayed our family. I don't know what's left to say. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I didn't mean for this to happen. She choked out. I was lonely, Mike. You've been so distant, so focused on work, and Brad, he was there. Her words were like daggers, twisting in my chest. Don't you dare try to blame this on me, I said, my voice rising. I worked late to provide for this family. To give you and Ethan everything you could ever need. And this is how you repay me? I made a mistake, she said, looking up at me with pleading eyes. I'll do anything to fix this. Please, Mike, don't give up on us. But it was too late. You didn't just hurt me, I said, my voice breaking. You hurt Ethan. And that's something I'll never forgive. That night, I slept in the guest room, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Jennifer had tried to come in, to plead her case again, but I told her to leave me alone. The next morning, I called a lawyer. This wasn't going to end with apologies and promises. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me or Ethan any longer. Jennifer had made her choice. And now, I was making mine. The next morning felt surreal, like waking up in the aftermath of a storm. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with unspoken tension. Ethan had already left for school by the time I got up, and Jennifer was sitting at the kitchen table, staring into her coffee cup like it held the answers to all her problems. She looked up when I entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Mike, she said softly, her voice trembling. Can we please talk? I ignored her, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. My lawyer's number was already saved in my phone, and I planned to call as soon as I got to the office. Mike, she said again, more insistent this time. I set the coffee pot down with a little more force than necessary, turning to face her. What, Jennifer? What could you possibly say to me that I haven't already heard? She flinched, her hands wrapping tightly around her mug. I want to fix this, she said, her voice breaking. I know I messed up. You didn't mess up, I interrupted, my tone icy. You made a choice. Repeatedly. For months. Don't insult me by pretending this was some kind of mistake. She opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off again. And let's not forget what you did to Ethan. You made him lie to me, to protect you. Do you have any idea what that did to him? To us? Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. I didn't know what else to do, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Well, congratulations, I said bitterly. You've managed to destroy everything. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, leaving her sitting there, her sobs echoing in the empty kitchen. At work, I called my lawyer during lunch, laying everything out in excruciating detail. The affair, the video, Ethan's involvement, it all spilled out in a flood of anger and frustration. You've got a strong case, the lawyer said. Especially if you can prove the emotional impact on your son. Judges don't look kindly on situations like this. I don't care about punishing her, I said, though part of me wasn't sure that was true. I just want to protect Ethan. And you will, the lawyer assured me. We'll file for temporary custody right away. Have you told her you're moving forward with this? Not yet, I admitted. Take your time, he said. But don't wait too long. The sooner we act, the better. That evening, I sat Ethan down after dinner, determined to be honest with him without overwhelming him. He deserved to know what was happening, but I didn't want to put more weight on his already burdened shoulders. Hey, bud, I said, sitting next to him on the couch. Can we talk for a minute? He nodded, setting his tablet aside. Am I in trouble? No, I said quickly. Not at all. I wanted to let you know what's going on. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? I talked to a lawyer today, I said carefully. About Mom. And about what's been happening. His face fell, and I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Ethan, this isn't your fault. None of this is your fault. But I need you to know that I'm going to take care of you, no matter what happens. Okay? He nodded slowly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. Are you going to leave her? I hesitated, then said, I don't know yet. But I think it's the right thing to do. For both of us. He sniffled, wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. I don't want things to be like this. I know, I said, pulling him into a hug. Neither do I. But we'll get through it. Together. The next morning, I told Jennifer I was filing for divorce. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just sat there, staring at me with a hollow expression. I'll move out, she said quietly. If that's what you want. I want what's best for Ethan, I said. And right now, that means giving him a stable, honest home. Something you haven't done in a long time. Her lips trembled, but she nodded. I'll pack my things tonight. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Jennifer moved into a small apartment across town, and Ethan stayed with me. We started going to therapy together, slowly working through the anger and pain that had seeped into every corner of our lives. Jennifer tried to stay involved, calling and visiting Ethan regularly, but their relationship was strained. Ethan wasn't ready to forgive her, and I didn't blame him. As for me, I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Ethan, my own sense of self, and a life that no longer revolved around lies and betrayal. One night, as Ethan and I sat on the couch watching a movie, he leaned his head against my shoulder. Thanks, Dad, he said softly. For what? I asked. For being here, he said. For being you. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I smiled. Always, Bud. Always. The days after Jennifer moved out were a mix of relief and sorrow. The house felt quieter, emptier in a way I couldn't explain. I had spent years with her, building a life that I thought was unbreakable, only to watch it crumble in front of me. Ethan adjusted better than I expected, though his emotions came in waves. One minute, he'd be joking about school or talking about his soccer team, and the next, he'd grow quiet, staring out the window like he was lost in thought. I tried to give him space while also letting him know I was there for him. We'd started going to therapy together, and while he didn't say much in the sessions, I could see the weight on his shoulders beginning to lift. One evening, a few weeks after Jennifer left, Ethan and I were in the kitchen making dinner. He was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce while I chopped vegetables for a salad. Dad? He said suddenly, his voice tentative. Yeah, Bud? I replied, glancing over at him. Do you think Mom's bad? The question caught me off guard. I set the knife down and turned to face him. What do you mean? I mean, what she did was bad, he said, his brow furrowed. But does that make her a bad person? I took a deep breath, considering my answer carefully. I think people are complicated, I said finally. Sometimes they make really bad choices that hurt the people they care about. But that doesn't always mean they're bad. He nodded slowly, though he didn't look entirely convinced. Do you hate her? No, I said honestly. I'm angry at her. And I don't know if I can forgive her for what she did. But I don't hate her. She's still your mom, and I want you to know it's okay to love her. Ethan didn't respond right away. He gave the sauce another stir, his eyes fixed on the pot. I don't know if I do, he said quietly. My heart ached hearing those words, but I didn't push him. That's okay, I said. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take your time. Jennifer called a few times that week, asking to see Ethan. I didn't stop her, though I made it clear the visits needed to be on his terms. The first visit was awkward. Ethan barely said 2 words to her, and I could see the hurt in her eyes as she tried to bridge the gap between them. But he wasn't ready, and I didn't blame him. I stayed in the background, giving them space but keeping an ear out just in case. When the visit ended, Ethan hugged me tightly, like he needed reassurance that I wasn't going anywhere. Over the next few months, life began to take on a new rhythm. Ethan and I developed a routine: dinners together, movie nights on Fridays, and soccer practice on weekends. I threw myself into being the best father I could be, knowing that he needed stability more than anything else. Jennifer's presence in our lives grew smaller. She called less often, and her visits became sporadic. Part of me was angry at her for giving up so easily, but another part of me was relieved. Ethan didn't need the constant reminder of what had happened. I focused on my own healing, too. Therapy helped me process the anger and betrayal, and for the first time in years, I started thinking about what I wanted for my own future. One Saturday, Ethan and I decided to tackle the backyard. The garden had been neglected for years, and weeds had taken over the flower beds. As we worked side by side, pulling weeds and planting new flowers, Ethan suddenly said, "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" I paused, brushing dirt off my gloves. "I think normal might look a little different now," I said. "But yeah, I think we'll find it. Eventually." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I hope so." "Me too, but," I said, ruffling his hair. "Me too." That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me and said, "Thanks, Dad." "For what?" I asked, surprised. "For not giving up," he said simply. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I smiled. "Never," I said. "You and me, we've got this." And for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that, no matter what, we'd find our way forward. Life settled into a quiet rhythm over the next several months. Ethan and I had carved out a new normal for ourselves, and though the sting of Jennifer's betrayal hadn't completely faded, it felt less like an open wound and more like a scar, a reminder of what we'd been through but also of how far we'd come. Ethan seemed lighter, happier even, though the cracks in his relationship with Jennifer remained. She called occasionally, and sometimes he'd pick up, but their conversations were short, stilted. On the rare occasions she visited, he kept his distance, answering her questions with one-word responses and retreating to his room as soon as he could. I didn't push him. I figured he needed time, just like I did. One afternoon, as I was cleaning out the garage, I came across an old box of photo albums. Inside were snapshots of the life we used to have: vacations, birthday parties, lazy Sunday mornings. Pictures of Jennifer and me, smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. I sat on the cold garage floor, flipping through the pages, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. There had been good times, great times even, but they felt like they belonged to a different life, a different version of me. As I looked at a picture of Jennifer holding a baby Ethan, I realized something. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't forgive her, not fully, but the anger that had consumed me for so long was starting to fade. She'd made her choices, and I couldn't change that. But I could choose how I moved forward. That evening, as Ethan and I sat down for dinner, I decided to bring up something that had been on my mind. "Hey, bud," I said, spearing a piece of broccoli with my fork. "How would you feel about going on a trip this summer? Just the two of us." His eyes lit up, the first real spark of excitement I'd seen in a while. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere you want," I said. "Well, within reason. I'm not sure we can pull off a trip to space just yet." He laughed, a genuine, hearty laugh that warmed my heart. "Can we go to the Grand Canyon? I've always wanted to see it." "The Grand Canyon it is," I said, raising my glass of water and a toast. Planning the trip gave us both something to look forward to, a light at the end of the tunnel. We spent evenings poring over travel guides and maps, picking out hiking trails and places to stop along the way. It wasn't just about the destination, it was about creating new memories, ones that weren't tied to the past or the pain we'd endured. In the weeks leading up to the trip, Jennifer called more frequently. She'd heard about our plans through Ethan, and though she didn't say it outright, I could tell she was hurt that she hadn't been included. "Are you sure this is the best thing for him?" she asked during one of her calls. "What's that supposed to mean?" I replied, my tone defensive. I just think he needs stability, she said carefully. Not a road trip across the country. Jennifer, the only instability he's faced lately has come from you, I said bluntly. This trip is good for him. For both of us. She didn't argue further, but the conversation left a sour taste in my mouth. The day of the trip finally arrived, and as we loaded the car with suitcases and snacks, Ethan seemed more excited than I'd seen him in months. Let's hit the road, Dad, he said, climbing into the passenger seat. We spent the first few hours of the drive singing along to the radio and sharing stories. Ethan told me about a science project he was working on, and I told him about a time I'd gotten lost on a hiking trail as a teenager. As the miles stretched behind us, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. When we reached the Grand Canyon, the sight took my breath away. Ethan stood at the edge of the overlook, his eyes wide with wonder. This is amazing, he said, his voice filled with awe. Yeah, I said, snapping a picture of him with my phone. It really is. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly living, not just surviving, but thriving. That night, as we sat around a campfire under a sky full of stars, Ethan turned to me and said, I'm glad we did this, Dad. Me too, I said, ruffling his hair. He hesitated for a moment, then added, Do you think Mom will ever, I don't know, be part of this again? I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. That's up to her, I said. But no matter what happens, you and I, we've got this. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah. We do. The trip wasn't just a getaway, it was a turning point. It reminded me that life goes on, that even after heartbreak and betrayal, there's still beauty to be found, still joy to be created. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, not just for Ethan, but for myself. And that was enough. Returning home from the Grand Canyon felt like waking up from a dream. The trip had been everything I'd hoped for, an escape, a chance to reconnect with Ethan, and a way to create new memories that weren't clouded by the past. As we pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of the house brought a mix of emotions. This was the place where everything had fallen apart, but it was also where Ethan and I had begun to rebuild. Ethan grabbed his backpack and bounded into the house, looking more energized than I'd seen him in months. I followed behind, carrying the last of the luggage. Are we really back already? He asked, flopping onto the couch. Afraid so, I said with a grin. But hey, now you've got an awesome story to tell your friends. He smiled, his face lighting up in a way that made all the effort worth it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine. Ethan was thriving. His grades improved, he was more engaged at soccer practice, and he seemed genuinely happy. Jennifer called less often, and when she did, her conversations with Ethan were brief. She didn't mention the trip, though I suspected it still bothered her that she hadn't been included. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up the yard, my phone buzzed with a text from her. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. About what? Her reply came quickly, about everything. That evening, after Ethan went to bed, Jennifer came over. I waited for her on the back porch, a pitcher of iced tea on the table between us. She sat down, looking nervous, her hands twisting in her lap. Thanks for letting me come by, she said. Let's just get to the point, I said, keeping my tone neutral. She nodded, taking a deep breath. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she began. About us. About what I did. I stayed silent, letting her continue. I know I can't undo what happened, she said, her voice trembling. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to be better, for Ethan if nothing else. Her words hung in the air, and I felt a pang of something, pity, maybe, or a faint echo of the love I used to feel for her. I don't hate you, Jennifer, I said finally. But trust is something you can't rebuild overnight. And right now, my priority is Ethan. I know, she said quickly. I don't want him to hate me. He doesn't hate you, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. But he's hurt. It's going to take time. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I want to be there for him. I want to help him heal, too. That's up to him, I said. I'm not going to force him to spend time with you if he's not ready. Jennifer looked down, her shoulders slumping. I understand. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets. After she left, I sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if I should give her more of a chance to make amends. But another part of me knew that healing, real healing, wasn't something you could rush. The important thing was that Ethan and I were okay. We were moving forward, one step at a time. One evening, as Ethan and I were finishing up dinner, he looked at me and said, "Do you think Mom's really sorry?" I considered his question carefully. "I think she regrets what happened," I said. "But being sorry isn't the same as fixing things." He nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think we'll ever be a family again?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "We are a family," I said. "You and me, Bud. That hasn't changed." He smiled, and for the first time, I felt like we were going to be okay. The months turned into a year, and slowly, life began to take on a new shape. Jennifer remained a part of Ethan's life, though their relationship was still a work in progress. She made an effort to show up for his soccer games and school events, and while Ethan didn't always seem thrilled to see her, he didn't push her away entirely. As for me, I focused on building a future for the two of us. I took up running, joined a local book club, and even started dabbling in cooking, something Ethan found endlessly amusing. One night, as we sat at the dinner table eating a slightly overcooked lasagna, Ethan said, "You're getting better at this, Dad." "Thanks," I said with a grin. "Next time, I might even try dessert." "Don't get ahead of yourself," he teased, laughing. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. Time has a funny way of softening even the sharpest edges. A year after Jennifer moved out, the life Ethan and I had built together felt more solid, more stable. It wasn't the life I'd envisioned when I married her, but it was ours, and it was good. Jennifer continued to be a presence in Ethan's life, though their relationship was still cautious. She showed up for the big things, his soccer tournaments, parent-teacher conferences, but Ethan kept her at arm's length. "She's trying," he said one evening after she'd left one of his games. "But it's weird, you know? It doesn't feel like before." "I know," I said, sitting next to him on the couch. "Things are different now. But different doesn't always mean bad." He nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Do you ever miss her?" The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "Sometimes," I said. "Not the person she became, but the way things used to be. Before all of this." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I miss that too." As the months passed, I started to notice subtle changes in Ethan. He laughed more, talked more, and seemed to be finding his footing again. One evening, as we were sitting at the dinner table, he said, "You know, Dad, you should date someone." I nearly choked on my water. "What?" "I'm serious," he said, grinning. "You're not that old. You could totally find someone." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," I said, laughing. "But I think I'm good for now." He shrugged. "Just saying. You deserve to be happy too." The idea lingered in my mind longer than I expected. I hadn't thought much about dating. I was too focused on Ethan, on work, on rebuilding my life. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. I wasn't looking for anything serious, but I wanted to see what was out there. So, one Saturday, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, creating a profile on a dating app. Ethan walked in halfway through and leaned over my shoulder, smirking. "What are you doing?" "Nothing," I said, quickly minimizing the screen. "Dad, you're terrible at lying," he said, laughing. I sighed. "Okay, fine. I'm checking out this dating app." "Good," he said, grabbing a soda from the fridge. "Just promise me you won't pick someone weird." To my surprise, the app wasn't as terrible as I expected. I chatted with a few people, went on a couple of casual dates, and even made a new friend or two. But there was one person who stood out, Claire. She was funny, smart, and down-to-earth, with a sense of humor that put me at ease immediately. We started messaging back and forth, and before long, we'd arranged to meet for coffee. The date was simple, just an hour at a quiet cafe downtown, but it was enough to remind me of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I saw each other a few more times. I didn't tell Ethan right away. I didn't want to introduce someone new into his life until I was sure it was serious. When I finally did tell him, his reaction was surprisingly positive. "Claire?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "She sounds cool. Can I meet her?" "Eventually," I said. "I want to make sure it's the right time." "Okay," he said, grinning. "But I'm calling dibs on embarrassing you when I do." The first meeting between Ethan and Claire went better than I could have hoped. We met for lunch at a casual diner, and within minutes, they were chatting like old friends. "She's pretty awesome, Dad," Ethan said on the drive home. "You did good." "Thanks," I said, smiling. For the first time, I felt like the pieces of my life were falling into place again. Jennifer, of course, found out eventually. She didn't say much when she heard about Claire, but there was a sadness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. "You've moved on," she said during one of our handoffs with Ethan. "I had to," I replied simply. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm glad you're happy," she said, though her voice sounded hollow. "I hope you find that too," I said. And I meant it. As I sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And that was enough. Months passed, and life continued to settle into its new rhythm. Ethan was thriving at school and on the soccer field, his confidence growing with every passing week. As for me, I was learning to embrace the unexpected twists my life had taken. Claire had become a steady presence in my life. Our relationship was easy, filled with shared laughter and quiet moments of understanding. She never pressured me to rush anything, and I appreciated her patience more than I could put into words. Ethan adored her, which made all the difference. Watching the two of them joke and bond over board games or old movies warmed my heart in ways I hadn't thought possible after everything that had happened. Jennifer remained a quieter part of our lives. She still saw Ethan regularly, and while their relationship was far from what it used to be, there was progress. One evening, as I dropped Ethan off at her apartment, Jennifer stopped me at the door. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked. I hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who had already disappeared into her living room. "Sure," I said finally, stepping inside. She gestured for me to sit, and I followed her to the couch, unsure of what to expect. "I wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice steady but soft, "for not turning Ethan against me. For giving me the chance to make things right with him." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "I know I don't deserve it," she continued. "But I'm trying, Mike. I really am." "I can see that," I said. "And I know Ethan does too. It's going to take time." "I know," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just hope one day he can forgive me." "Maybe," I said, standing. "But that's up to him." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I hope you're happy, Mike. I mean that." "Thank you," I said, my voice sincere. "I hope you find happiness too." That evening, as I sat on the couch with Claire, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. A year ago, my life had felt like it was falling apart. Now, it felt like I was finally building something new, something better. "Penny for your thoughts?" Claire asked, nudging me gently. I smiled, taking her hand in mine. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," I said. She laughed softly. "You're not so bad yourself." A few weeks later, Ethan had his final soccer game of the season. Jennifer and Claire were both there, sitting on opposite sides of the bleachers. It wasn't awkward, though. It felt oddly normal, like two separate parts of my life coexisting peacefully. Ethan scored the winning goal in the last few minutes of the game, and the crowd erupted into cheers. He looked up at the stands, his face beaming, and I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. After the game, we all gathered by the field. Jennifer congratulated Ethan, her smile genuine, and Claire handed him a water bottle, ruffling his hair affectionately. As we walked to the car, Ethan turned to me and said, "You know, Dad, things aren't so bad anymore." I smiled, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "No, Bud," I said. "They're not. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were exactly where we were meant to be,